Now the Israelites went out to fight against the Philistines. The Israelites camped at Ebenezer, and the Philistines at Aphek. The Philistines deployed their forces to meet Israel, and as the battle spread, Israel was defeated by the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 of them in the battlefield. When the soldiers returned to camp, the elders of Israel asked, "Why did the Lord bring defeat on us today before the Philistines? Let us bring the ark of the Lord's covenant from Shiloh, so that he may go with us and save us from the hand of our enemies." So the people sent men to Shiloh, and they brought back the ark of the covenant of the Lord Almighty, who's enthroned between the cherubim. And Eli's 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the ark of the covenant of God. When the ark of the Lord's covenant came into the camp, all Israel raised such a great shout that the ground shook. Hearing the uproar, the Philistines asked, "What's all this shouting in the Hebrew camp?" When they learned that the ark of the Lord had come into the camp, the Philistines were afraid. "A god has come into the camp," they said. "Oh no, nothing like this has happened before. We're doomed. Who will deliver us from the hand of these mighty gods? They are the gods who struck the Egyptians with all kinds of plagues in the wilderness. Be strong, Philistines, be men, or you will be subject to the Hebrews as they have been to you. Be men and fight." So the Philistines fought, and the Israelites were defeated, and every man fled to his tent. The slaughter was very great. Israel lost 30,000 foot soldiers. The ark of God was captured, and Eli's 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, died. Verse 12, that same day a Benjamite ran from the battle line and went to Shiloh with his clothes torn and dust on his head. When he arrived, there was Eli sitting on his chair by the side of the road, watching because his heart feared for the ark of God. When the man entered the town and told what had happened, the whole town sent up a cry. Eli heard the outcry and asked, "What is the meaning of this uproar?" The man hurried over to Eli, who was 98 years old and whose eyes had failed so that he could not see. He told Eli, "I have just come from the battle line. I fled from it this very day." Eli asked, "What happened, my son?" The man who brought the news replied, "Israel fled before the Philistines, and the army has suffered heavy losses. Also your 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the ark of God has been captured." When he mentioned the ark of God, Eli fell backward off his chair by the side of the gate. His neck was broken, and he died, for he was an old man, and he was heavy. He had led Israel 40 years. His daughter-in-law, the wife of Phinehas, was pregnant and near the time of delivery. When she heard the news that the ark of God had been captured and that her father-in-law and her husband were dead, she went into labor and gave birth, but was overcome by her labor pains. As she was dying, the woman attending her said, "Don't despair, you have given birth to a son." But she did not respond or pay any attention. She named the boy Ichabod, saying, "The glory has departed from Israel," because of the capture of the ark of God and the deaths of her father-in-law and her husband. She said, "The glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured." Amen.
We are spending some time together as a church listening to God's voice through this Old Testament book called 1 Samuel, and it's one of the history books of the ancient sort of story of the people of Israel. And we were introduced last week to this special leader chosen by God that God is raising up, the young boy as he was at the time, Samuel. But he sort of almost is parked to one side while we return to this really terrible family that had such an influence on the people of Israel at that time, the family of Eli. And what we see in today's text that Laura has just read for us are 2 blockages to receiving God's blessing. 2 blockages to receiving God's blessing. We come to church, I think, wanting to receive something from God, some sort of spiritual blessing, don't we? I do anyway. Maybe that's you. You want to know something of God, perhaps. You want to be strengthened by God. Who doesn't want that? You maybe want to experience his delivering power or receive some of his gifts, and we come and say, yes, please, Lord, we want that. And that really applies to you, whether you're, I think, a believer in Jesus or if you're just interested in looking in from the outside. We come wanting blessing. But did you know that you can actually block blessing? Did you know you can block blessing yourself? And you can actually stop it. Or in other words, you can sort of cut yourself off from God's desire to bless you. We all have that power. And so we're going to be looking at why that is and what ways we do that together as we look through these verses. And often these are blockages that lurk hidden in our hearts. You may not be directly aware of them. Hopefully you will be by the end of today's Bible talk. But these two blockages we're going to examine together, and I hope that as we go through, you might identify with one or both of them, perhaps. And if you identify with them, that means you can be helped to unblock the system. We're using sort of plumbing language today. I'm sorry about that. Help to unblock the system so that God's blessing can flow to you. What are those two blockages? The first is superstition, and the second is resistance. Superstition and resistance. So let's look, first of all, at superstition. Superstition blocks God's blessing in your life. If you've been reading through 1 Samuel and listening to the Bible talks that we've been going through as a church, you're sort of ready for this moment to happen. We know that we are going to be in for some trouble as we read through 1 Samuel chapter 4. As I've mentioned, the chief priest, the old man called Eli, the most holy man in all of Israel, we know about him, and he's been getting in trouble with God and his awful sons. We've been learning about them. We've been learning that Eli, the old man, has just been permitting his sons to carry on any way they want. He is the senior chief priest. His two sons are senior priests under the father, and they've been stealing from God. They've been sleeping with women in the who come and volunteer in the tent of God's meeting place, like the temple. They've been skimming off of all the sacrifices, making themselves literally fat with all the stuff that God says, no, that belongs to me, and they've been taking it anyway. We know they're in for trouble. And as we've been saying over the last few weeks, God says, I'm going to wipe you lot out, and I'm going to replace you with my chosen one, with Samuel. And so that's the background to the story that we bring before us this morning, and we're coming then to look at this scenario here. And we see the scenario unfold to us. It's a battle scene, isn't it? In verses 1 and 2 of our text. The people of Israel, it says, went out to fight the Philistines, depending on how you pronounce it. Who are the Philistines? At that time of Israel's history, they were the arch enemies of Israel. The bad guys. If they were in the panto, we'd boo when we hear mention of the Philistines. They were the bad guys. Do you remember Goliath, the big giant that David takes on? He's one of them. He's a Philistine. We'll see that in a few weeks' time. Anyway, they had a terrible day, Israel. They went out to meet their arch enemies in this battle. It says there in verse 2 that Israel was defeated. About 4,000 of their soldiers died. It was an awful day. It was a terrifying battle, and they got thoroughly beaten. And beaten and bruised and dragging themselves back, they went back to the camp. And of course, the post-mortem sort of starts. What on earth happened? The question there in verse 3, you can read it with me. Why did the Lord bring defeat on us? Why did the Lord bring defeat on us? That, I think, is the first sign in this story, in this narrative, that there's a problem. The first sign is that they blamed God for their battlefield loss. In other words, they were saying to themselves as they got back and started to take stock, we should have won that. That's what they're saying. We should have been victorious. Why didn't God come through for us as he should have done? Why didn't he do what we wanted him to do? That's what they're asking of God. And that seems to be the problem that we start to see unfolded in these verses here. They expected God to act according to their plans. And they were disappointed when he didn't come through for them. That's what's going on here. And so someone came up with a bright idea in verse 3. You know what? Let's bring the ark of the Lord's covenant, the ark of God's covenant, so that he, that is God, may go with us and save us from our enemies. That was their answer. What is the ark? You might ask. The ark was it's not Noah's ark, it's a different ark. It's a little box, a sacred box that was constructed by the people of Israel when they were wandering around in the wilderness for 40 years on their way to the promised land. God designed the box. He gave them the instructions about how to make it, and they went ahead in obedience and made it, along with all the other mechanisms of worship that he gave to them through Moses. And the box itself wasn't very big, a couple of maybe 2 or 3 feet in diameter. In length, a couple of feet high, perhaps. It was a box made of expensive wood, overlaid with gold, the most precious stuff they had at their disposal. And on top of this box was this magnificent pair of angelic beings. They're called cherubim in verse 4, sort of angelic beings. And God said to Moses, in fact, the verses are up here, between these angelic beings on this special box in Exodus 25, it says there, God says, above the cover, between the 2 cherubim that are over the ark of the covenant, I will meet with you, and I will give you all my commands for the Israelites. It was an incredibly special space. There was no place like it on earth. The place where God promised to meet with his people, to speak to them. The presence of God was there. The glory of God was there. And he chose to take up, as it were, residence between these 2 wings of these golden cherubim that had been put on top of the box. Is God everywhere? Yes, he is. Is he sovereign? Yes, he is. Is he beyond all things in the universe? Yes, he is. But he chose to put his special presence there between the wings of these 2 cherubim. And from there, he would be with his people. That's the box. And so someone has the bright idea, let's bring him with us. We need some extra firepower. We were thoroughly beaten by the Philistines. Let's bring the box. That's what someone says. And off they go. They're saying to themselves, surely, if God comes with us on top of this box, then something's going to work. We've got his box. He'll have to come through for us. That's what they're saying. And so it says someone went to Shiloh, the place where the Ark of God's covenant was, in the middle of this extravagant tent system where people could make sacrifices. They went there. They took the Ark with them. It could only be carried by priests. That's why Eli's 2 sons were there. It says in verse 4, with the Ark of the covenant of God. Do you notice Eli's 2 sons accompanying it, getting drawn into the battlefield? They don't know what's about to happen. We do. And off they go. And so the Ark of the Covenant, says, did the trick at the start in verse 5. The Ark came into the camp and all Israel raised such a great shout. The ground shook. Not only that, it cast fear into the enemies. You see that in verses 6 through to 8. The enemies, the Philistines on the other side of this valley or this river. What on earth is going on, they're asking. What has just happened to the Israelites over there? A god must have come into their camp. That's the only thing that can explain this mighty roar. Oh my goodness, says the Philistines, we are doomed. They seem to be, they knew a bit about Israel's gods. In verse 8 and 9, they said, isn't he the one who struck down the Egyptians with all these plagues in the wilderness? The details of their knowledge of God, the God of Israel, is a bit iffy. But they get the point. Something massive has just happened here. Right, lads, they say, we've got to fight or die. There's only one way out of this ditch, and we come out fighting. And so the enemy were rallied. Be like men, it says there. Fight. Fight for your nation. And the result, as we see in verse 10, is not quite what the Israelites hoped. In fact, we could say it backfired significantly, completely. The Philistines fought, it says in verse 10, and the Israelites were defeated. Everyone ran back to their camp, it said, and the slaughter was very great. 30,000 soldiers fell that day. That is an extraordinary number of people to die in battle in one day. Not only that, the slaughter was great. Israel was on the run. It says the ark of God was captured, and with it, Eli's 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, died. Utter humiliation of the people of Israel. Their sacred box was gone. Their senior priests were dead. Israel was humiliated. It could not have gone much worse. Or so they thought. Let's take stock for a moment or two. And you might be like those who did manage to survive that battle that day. And you might be asking yourself, well, what on earth has just happened? Why has this happened? Because surely, when we look on, surely God was with them. They brought the ark. It cast fear into the enemies. And so we read this and we ask, well, why did God not help them when he should have? Why did God not bless us with victory? They would be asking. But there's the problem. That's why it spectacularly backfired that day. It seems that the Israelites completely misunderstood God. That's not how you treat God. That's why this backfired spectacularly. Because they thought to themselves, right, we've got his sacred box. And therefore, if we've got his sacred box, then we can get God to come with us. Right? We can get God to do what we want him to do. They thought to themselves, we can bring him into our battle. Surely he's going to come through for us. Surely he will do what we want him to do. That's what they're saying. They tried to make God do what they wanted rather than asking God what he wanted. That's what they did. They thought, we've got his box. We can make God fight for us. That's what they were thinking. They thought they could get a blessing because they had some special object with them. Otherwise, they were superstitious. It was a blockage to their blessing. Superstition, I think, is really common today, isn't it? You'll find a lot of people who are superstitious. They might tell you, I'm very superstitious. And the way they behave and the sort of things they do. Maybe you've seen people who have a rabbit's foot on their keychain. It's meant to bring good luck. Or some sort of lucky charm. Not so lucky for the rabbit, but it might bring good luck, they think, to the person who has it in their bag or something like that. And the idea is with such things, whether it's something you put around your neck or something you have in your house or whatever it might be, this object, the very presence of this object brings me good luck. Right? It brings me some blessing or other, some sort of protection. I get some sort of benefit from having this thing, Touch wood, we say. We try and find a bit of wood. Touch wood. It's superstition, isn't it? And we think that by doing a thing or touching something or having a thing, we get some blessing from it. And superstition, I think, is very common. You might describe yourself as a superstitious person. It's sort of common, let's say, outside the church, we might say. But you know what? I actually think there is a form of superstition that's quite common inside the church as well. Not just outside, inside. Your mind might go, for example, to certain religious ceremonies that you've maybe witnessed, or perhaps you've seen if you've been on holiday in a foreign country, in a hot country, let's just say, Spain or someplace like that. And sometimes, the people in the certain towns or what have you, build up to this particular festival, whatever it might be. They might parade around with the Virgin Mary or some other saint or something like that, and they bring them all around and lights and music and noise, and everyone dresses up and has a great time. And what's going on is that the people in that town or village or wherever it is think to themselves, because we have this object with us, because we have this thing, it gives us some power. Right? Or it gives us some blessing, or something good will happen to our village, some protection. That's what they're saying. It's kind of a religious form of superstition, and it's not far away from what we see here in chapter 4. My life as a doctor in hospital, I've seen this plenty of times. It's amazing how religious people become when there's a fear of sickness or a fear of death. Everybody seems to become religious when perhaps they weren't religious beforehand. And I've seen plenty of times when either people who come into hospital for on their own, or maybe family members bring in all sorts of religious items that they hope will provide some sort of blessing or some sort of help. Whether it's holy water, you see sometimes little tubs of holy water, prayer books, pictures of various saints, rosary beads, all these sorts of things. That seems to be what we're like as people. As I say, even if we're not particularly religious ourselves, when it comes to certain times in life, we want to grab onto something that's going to give us help. Anything. We'll open the doors to anything. And we think, well, we'll appeal to God or the gods or whoever they are, the spirits out there. We can become very spiritual. Often there's no more than an empty hope, but when we're lying there in the hospital bed or our friend or family member is lying there, we think, well, what have we got to lose? And so we become quite superstitious, quite religious, but superstitious. We think, these objects must have power. And if you're a regular here at Foundation Church, you might ask yourself, well, surely these things can't happen in a Bible-centered church, right? A church that practices and believes based on what God says in the Bible. Surely we don't have superstition. Unfortunately, that's not the case either. Whether it's a particular paint scheme or the hymn books that we use or the layout of the chairs or whatever it might be, we can, as people who follow Jesus, we can assign spiritual power to things that were never intended to have spiritual power. We can all do it. We can say, because we have this or because we do that, we can expect the blessing of God. Even in the realm of our minds, we can entertain superstition without even having trinkets or rosary beads in our homes or whatever they might be. Whether it's our strategy or our decision-making or our planning or our organization, these are all helpful things, but we can assume that because we have those in place, God will bless us. Because we have been clever, God will bless us. And here's the key. Here's how you know if this might be you. You end up praying, God bless my plans, without actually inviting him to speak from the start. That's superstition. He must act because I've planned it. We say, here's what we want you to do, God, and here's how we expect you to act. And then we assume that he will come through for us. And that's exactly what they're doing here in chapter 4. So I wonder, are you a superstitious person? You may actually have a rabbit's foot, literally a rabbit's foot, on your keychain. And if you do, then it's pretty obvious, isn't it? You're a superstitious person. Or maybe you possess some of the items that we've already talked about. And if that's the case, then it's easy for you to detect whether you're superstitious or not. But what about those of us who maybe have superstitious tendencies without possessing such items, whatever they may be? What if you are a Christian who is superstitious? Let me give you one test. That's one test. Only one way this might apply. To try and dig out whether you have fallen into the trap of chapter 4 here. Think to yourself, this is your test, by the way. Think to yourself about the last major decision that you have made. The last major sort of life-shaping decision that you've made. Could be something to do with your job, where you have sought to go, what you have sought to do. Could be something relating to your home life. Perhaps a relationship that you have newly begun. Perhaps some other big change for you in your life or your family. Maybe a financial decision that you have made. Think about any of such major decision. Have you got it? All right. And ask yourself then, how did that decision come about for you? How did that decision come about? How did you arrive at your decision? Did you put loads of thought into it? Discuss it thoroughly? Put lots of reason into it? Perhaps you drew some spreadsheets to work out the financial cost. Some people love spreadsheets. I do not. Some people love them. If you're that person, please speak to me afterwards. We need administrators here at the church. Bless God for that. Maybe you love to get your calculator out and count the cost, quite literally. Maybe you prefer to go with how you feel instead. You work out what feels best, how you might be impacted. All these ways that you might have come to your conclusion. Say you made your decision along those lines. Did you only then say, God, bless my decision? God, come through for me. I've done all the hard work. Now it's your turn. God, I've put all these plans in place. I'm satisfied with my decision. Would you now come and add your blessing to it? Did you pray something along those lines? Did you expect God to come along with a rubber stamp and say, yes? Permission granted. If you only did bring God in at the end, and if you come to God and expect him to act according to your plans and your decisions and how you think he should act, then you're just like the people here in Israel's time. You've employed superstition. It's not faith. It's not God that you're after, it's your own will that you desire. It's all about what you want, not what he wants. Otherwise, you would have asked him at the start. You don't really want to follow God and his mission. You want him to follow you in your mission. Superstition. Instead, if you haven't done those things, if you began with prayer, opening your ears, fasting, speaking with mature Christians or leaders in your church, opening yourself even to prophetic word, if you've done that, you're less likely to be superstitious. But if you've done none of that and you just want some blessing sprinkled on you at the end, then as we're seeing here, that's a blockage to blessing. It's not a guarantee to it at all. It's a blockage. So that's the first blockage we see in the text. I wonder if that's something going on in your life, your heart. The second blockage we see then, doesn't get any better, I'm afraid, is resistance. It's the second blockage. The first blockage, we think we can get God to do what you want. The second blockage is you want to stop God from doing what he wants. See the difference? Resistance, stopping God from doing what he wants in you and around you. And the story, I suppose, as we carry on from verse 12 onwards, is no surprise to us again. Because Eli, the old chief priest, the most holy man in Israel, has been given not one, but two major messages from God about his life. Direct messages, first from a prophet, an unnamed prophet, we saw that in chapter 2. The second through the young boy Samuel, we saw that in chapter 3. Direct words of warning from God to Eli, specifically about what's going on in his life. It's amazing. Words of warning, words of condemnation, but two opportunities to turn back to God. It's amazing. Two opportunities, as we say, to repent. That is to turn back. Turn away from his sinful life and turn back to God. That's what repenting is. To change his ways. That's why God gave these two words, these two messages to Eli. Probably spaced between several years, if not a decade or so. God gives us these words not just to inform us, but to transform us. That's why he speaks like he does. That's why we always, as a church, want to listen to his voice through Scripture. And for Eli, that was an opportunity to realize his need. Okay, to take ownership of his errors, to admit his sins. This is a gift to Eli, because when he does that, he could then turn to God for forgiveness, for pardon, for blessing, to experience his mercy and his love and his kindness. He could have done all of that. That's what God intended through these words, these difficult words. Instead, what did Eli do with these two, as we say in medicine, barn door examples? You can't miss them. These two words that are so obvious to him. How could you miss them? What did he do with them? He resisted them. Eli, the most holy man in all Israel, resisted God's voice. He didn't listen. Instead, he hardened his heart to what God was saying. And he blocked his ears. Spiritual version of putting your hands over your ears like you would have done as kids and say, ah, la, 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 I can't hear you. That's what Eli did on a spiritual plane. What a fool. He paid the price. Look at how it turns out in verses 12 through 4. We know what's already taken place on the battlefield. It was an absolute disaster. Seems that some soldier or other escaped from the front line, went to Shiloh, the place where the ark was, the place where Samuel was, where Eli was, where the place of worship in this little town called Shiloh. Off he went. And it says he was covered in dust. He'd torn his clothes. That was a sort of a sign, an ancient sign of mourning, and terrible things had just happened. That's what they would have done to express that. And there's Eli, it says, in verse 13, sitting on his chair. The word also means throne. Bear that in mind. He's sitting there on his official chair, not just a little stool or something like that, but the actual sort of official priestly chair. And there he was. It says he was watching, which is ironic because he's blind. Again, a commentary on his spiritual condition. He could see, but he couldn't see. Watching for words. And it says the whole town, when they heard the news from this messenger, sent up a cry. Eli heard the cry, couldn't see the man, didn't know what was going on. He said, what's happened? And the man, I'm sure he wasn't looking forward to this bit, in verse 17, said this, well, do you want the good news or the bad news? Or the bad news or the worst news, actually? And he starts with the least worst and goes to the very worst. He says, well, not gone well. He says, Israel have fled before the Philistines. The army has suffered heavy losses. Your 2 sons are dead. And the ark of the God of Israel has been captured. It goes from least worst to worst. This could not have gone any worse. What Eli feared the most, it says that in verse 13, wasn't the protection of his sons. It was the ark of God's covenant, the ark of God's presence. And now it was in enemy hands. Remember the symbol of God's presence, of his favor, the place where God says, I will speak to you, I will be your God, and you will be my people. That place is gone. That place where God was living with his people, God has now left the building. That's what happened. Verse 18. When he mentioned the ark of God, Eli fell backwards off his chair by the side of the gate. His neck was broken and he died, for he was an old man and was heavy. He was enormous. Again, not just a commentary for us to sort of enjoy, although it is darkly comical. But he's so big because of the fat that he's been skimming off of the sacrifices that should have been burnt and offered to God. And him and his sons have been taking that and saying, no, we're going to steal that. We're going to enjoy the best bits for ourselves, thank you very much. That's why he was so fat. Everyone knew it. It was actually a commentary on his own sin. And actually it was his own sin, ironically, that killed him. The weight of him, the fall, his age, all of these things conspired against him. He fell backwards off his chair, snapped his neck, he was dead. What a way to go. What a way to end a 40-year career in leading God's people. You fall off your chair, you break your neck. What a humiliating death. At least those who die in battle, die with valor and bravery. But no, not this one here. His neck snapped because he was so fat. Don't forget, this is not by accident. We've seen this over the last few weeks. This was God's plan all along. He said, if you don't turn around and face me and come to me and stop all this sin going on in my place, God says, I will cut short your house. And I will raise up another servant instead, one who actually loves me and follows me and obeys me. and enjoys me. This is how he did it. God says, no, you've resisted me enough. I'm going to remove you from your throne. I'm going to topple your house. That's what he did. But it didn't end there. What a terrible day. What an awful day in the history of God's people. Verses 19 through 22 tell us that not only that, another generation of this priestly family was also caught up in all of this. The daughter-in-law, the wife of one of the ones who died in, one of the priests who died in combat, it tells us that she went into labor. She was with child, a third generation of the priestly family. She went into labor when she heard all this. It just sort of kicked off this spiral for her. It was a complicated labor. I've worked a bit in obstetrics over the years, and I know that when things go wrong, they go wrong very quickly. And everyone just suddenly descends to help. Not so in ancient Israel here. She had a few helpers by the looks of it, but that was it. It says this woman here, we don't know her name, was overcome by birth pains, and she died either during or after childbirth. Misery just continues for this family. And the midwives, or the friends of the women who are there, say, try and cheer her up a bit. You've got a son, they say. Someone's carry on the family line after all. Says the woman didn't respond. She just managed to rally herself enough to give him his name. Ichabod. What an odd name. The name Ichabod means no glory. Or otherwise, the glory has gone. That was the name of this boy. And a lifelong reminder that his family and their sin led to the departure of God's glory. Glory was gone. God had withdrawn. What a devastating day. That child was born an orphan. Both father and mother died on the same day for different reasons. The senior priesthood absolutely wiped out. It is likely that Shiloh, the town itself, was wiped out as well a bit later on. We're not told that directly, but the ark never goes back there. There's never any more mention of worship taking place in Shiloh like it did in the old days. Probably got destroyed. What a humiliating end. The glory was gone. And tragic as all this is, it seemed preventable. In fact, I would say doubly tragic because Eli was warned not once but twice. 2 prophetic words, clear as day, but he continued to resist God. He heard, but he resisted. He knew what God said and what he wanted, but he refused to act. Instead, he held back from God, right? He chose to hold on to what he wanted. The fat offerings. He continued to allow his sons to continue in their sinful disobedience. He held on to cherished things himself. He knew things he knew did not honor God, but actually he stopped caring if they honored God or not. These things that he held on to actually offended God, but he carried on anyway. He resisted God. It's desperate. That explains to us why all this is taking place. Resisted God. We could actually probably reduce the entire story of human history down to this one problem: resisting God. That's how it was at the start in Genesis chapter 3. When sin first came into the world, our first parents said no to God. They resisted his clear teaching to them, thought they should do it themselves in their own way. They knew what he wanted, instead they did it their way anyway. That's what happens when you resist God. You know what he wants, but you do something different anyway. And again we say to ourselves, much like the first blockage, superstition, we say, well, surely, this is not a problem that we have in the church. You know, surely this is something that happens to people who don't know God or don't believe in him or don't follow him. We get that. But surely this doesn't happen inside the church. Because isn't that why we're here? That we've sort of trusted in God and we're following Jesus. Isn't that what faith is all about? We've stopped resisting God at some point in our lives and we've said yes to God and we're following him and receiving the best. Isn't that what church is all about? Surely we can't be as Christians, as believers in Jesus, resisting God. You can probably tell by the way I've put it that that's not the case. That's not the case at all. Read with me here from Matthew chapter 7 from the New Testament. Jesus teaching this time. And remember, we're thinking about whether it's possible for Christians or believers or people who say they're believers to resist God. Jesus says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven." Listen to this. "Many will say to me on that day," that's Judgment Day, "Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? Then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers." Jesus is saying that there are some people who appear to be believers, who do Christian things, who say the right words. They can even do remarkable spiritual activities, to whom one day they will find out that Jesus says, "I never knew you." Imagine that. He might say, I never knew you. You've been resisting me all this time. You've been trying to look and sound and act Christian, but you've been keeping your heart from me, or at least part of it. You can have this bit, God, but not that bit. I'll give you my financial bit, but you can't touch my sex life. Or I'll give you my religious part, but you can't touch my family, and so forth. Just holding parts back. And look at the shocking thing here as well. If you can make it out on the third line there. Jesus says, "Many will say to me on that day." We're not just talking about a few people here. Many people, says Jesus, will spend their lives resisting him and just covering up their resistance with some God words, some God behaviors. That is truly shocking to me. We might even think to ourselves as we read this text, well, maybe that's just one or two Christians, a few bad apples. Surely entire churches can't be the same as that. Let's read this next text. I'm afraid to say it's quite depressing. Revelation chapter 3. This is Jesus, by the way. Before we read this, you've maybe heard this verse before. This is Jesus speaking to a church. Okay, he's talking to a church. "Here I am," he says to the church. "I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with that person, and they with me." He's not talking to specific individuals and asking them to open the door of their hearts to receive him by faith. That's a good thing to do. But he's talking to an entire church, whereupon Jesus is stood outside the church, knocking at the front door of their church, saying, "If you just open the door and let me in, I will come in." What sort of a church is so proficient on its own that Jesus isn't required? Isn't that a church that's been resisting him for their entire existence? They think that because they've got this or that or the other thing that God is pleased with them. But look at where Jesus is. It's the church of Laodicea, in case you're wondering. Revelation chapter 3. Taken together, these two New Testament passages show us that it is possible for people inside the church, if not for an entire church, to resist God. And that might explain a few things. It might explain why people are stuck, why there's no growth. Some Christians, or people who call themselves Christians, may appear to be stuck in a rut and never seem to show any signs of ever getting out of it. Just in this never-ending cycle of misery. Round and round and round and round they go. Most likely it's because they are resisting God. Most likely it's because they've pushed Jesus outside and he's knocking. They don't want to let him in. And so this morning, as we allow the weight of this to press down on us, may I just say that the warning to us this morning is just as stark as it is to Eli. And here's the warning. God says to us this morning, if you carry on resisting me, if you carry on hardening your heart towards me, one day you may hear these terrifying words. Away from me. I never knew you. Brothers, sisters, friends, I appeal to you. Do not resist God. Do not find yourself in the place where you know what he wants and you know what he says, but instead you do what you want anyway. You go your own way anyway. Friends, do not allow yourself to stay in that place. Whatever it is that you think you gain from being like that, let me tell you now, it is not worth it. Whatever you think you're attaining out of God's reach, it is not worth it. By the way, please do not forget that God wants to ruin your life and make things worse for you. That's what Adam and Eve thought when they made that fatal decision. Instead, we must see God for who he is, the one who wants to bless you, who wants to give you life, who wants you to experience his love, and yet we don't want to let go of the things that we cling to. We resist him because we think we know better. Friends, please don't resist God. We've seen those two blockages to receiving God's blessing, and we're almost done, but it would be wrong of me to simply lay these things out before you and then say, well, that's it, go and try harder. That's not at all going to help you or encourage you this morning. So I want to just finally finish on, briefly touch on how to renew the flow of God's blessing. We said at the start it's like a plumbing metaphor, okay? There's a few blockages. Maybe you've identified one or both in your own life. How can we renew the flow to receive God's blessing? The good news is this is not the end of the story. Even in Samuel's experience in 1 Samuel, the book that we've got in front of us, the ark does return. That's a wonderful thing. The ark was brought back, and we'll see that next week. But for us sitting here, maybe just feeling the weight of God's word pressing down upon us, this warning not to resist him, we're asking ourselves, perhaps we're crying out this morning, is it possible for us to renew the flow of God's blessing again? If we have resisted God, if we are currently resisting him, if we have resisted him for our entire lives, is it possible to come back to him? If we have given ourselves to superstition, is it possible to renew the blessing that we have robbed from ourselves? If we've been seeking God to control him, is there forgiveness for him What an offense that is, by the way, to try and control God. What fools we are. Can we come back to God even if we have caused such offense to him? And it's my joy to say, yes, of course. Yes, we can renew the flow of God's blessing, and here's why. It's because of his Son, Jesus. It's because of the gospel. That's how we know. Because in the gospel, Jesus left his throne in heaven to come to you. Unlike Eli, Jesus chose to be dethroned, as it were, so that he could come to you to save you. Jesus stepped down from his heavenly throne and his splendor and came so that he might save you. Whereas Ichabod is the son of no glory, Jesus is the Son of glory. Even John, the apostle who spent time with Jesus, 3 years living with him, following him, learning from him, as he looked back at the end of his life and he wrote his reflections in the Gospel of John, he said this about Jesus in John 1 verse 14, "We have seen his glory." Listen to this, "the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father." We've seen the Son of glory. He's returned. That's what John is saying here. See, it wasn't the ark that we needed. It's a person. Not just a holy box or some sacred item that could be stolen or destroyed. Not that at all. What we need ultimately is a holy person who would be with us forever. Who would not just live with us in vicinity, but actually would come and live within us and indwell us. That's what we needed. In the gospel, Jesus died a humiliating death. Not from falling off of his chair, but being nailed to the cross. In his death, Jesus took all of your superstitious rubbish. He took your resistant heart. He took your sins and your failures and your sorrow, and he took them upon himself. That's the gospel. It's the good news. And through that good news, through that gospel, through that cross, flows God's blessing to you. Don't resist him. Don't hang on to stuff. It's through Jesus that God's blessing flows to you. You receive that by faith in him alone. Trust. And so when you are facing major decisions in your life, whatever they may be, when you see Jesus as the glorious Son of God who gave himself for you, you will start to say, Lord, what do you want me to do? When you are going out, as it were, into battles, you will start to say, Lord, what are you commanding me to behave like? Where are you deploying me? When you understand the gospel, you see, you will be willing to be contradicted by God from time to time. You will have your plans scrapped and remade to something even more beautiful by him when you understand the gospel. Then you will know the favor of God. That's what he's done for you. So yes, it is possible to come back. It was possible for Eli. That's why God spoke in the first place. And it's possible for you this morning. If you're resisting, clinging on to superstition, whatever it might be, Jesus is for you.